Everyone, thank you and welcome. I think we're going to start. It's a very big room, this, so I would encourage people at the back to maybe come a bit forward so we can perhaps have more of a discussion, particularly when we get to the Q&A. But of course, if you don't want to. Well, thank you very much for coming. So my name is Amelie Amin. I'm the Division Chief on Climate Change at the Inter-American Development Bank. And we're very happy to be hosting this, co-hosting this event with the government of Chile. And in particular, two colleagues sitting just to my left and one to my right from the Chilean Center for Climate and Resilience Research, who are representing the government in this side event. Now, as I think that is obvious from the title, the focus of this discussion and this panel is really around how do we really turn NDCs into reality on the ground? How do we ensure that we can deliver the necessary investment that is required? And we see, certainly at the IDB, we see that there's a need to be much more strategic, if you like, in how we use our resources, whether that's climate finance, whether it's our expertise and our experience in support of implementation of countries' NDCs. And I'll say a little bit about that later on. But first, I think what probably is most useful for the flow of the conversation will be to hear from two countries in the region, from Chile and from Colombia, how they have developed their NDCs. We're going to hear first of all from Laura Gallardo Klena, who will talk in particular about how science and the role of science in shaping and developing the NDC. We will need to get the right presentation up. But please, Laura, if you'd like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is head for the Center for Climate and Resilience Research. This is a center of excellence funded by the Chilean government through our National Science Foundation, so to speak. And we're trying to provide relevant science to the decision-making process, but also still researching on a curiosity-driven basis. So I put together this presentation in the context of this co-organized meeting. How do we bring to reality the actions we need to put together? And there is the question whether or not science is still needed. Sometimes I've heard that science is not needed anymore. We know already that we are in a bad shape in facing this thing, and we have to face it. We don't need more science. So that's the question I want to answer. And I put it in the framework of the Anthropocene, which is a term that we have, people have put together in order to describe the times we are living in, and the times when the impact of human activities is become so large. So before I forget, thank you to the Ministry for Foreign Relations of Chile and the IDB for co-hosting this event. So I won't talk about layers in geology or how to define the Anthropocene or when does the Anthropocene begins, because that's a whole different, very interesting arena, but not the point. The point is that we are facing a time when not only our climate in terms of temperature and precipitation is being pushed by our activities, particularly by the use of fossil fuel, but also biodiversity, but also the quality of the air we are breathing in our cities, etc. The changes in the biochemical cycles, etc. It's a host of changes happening, and that's extremely difficult because each one of those problems are particularly different, complicated, and they are complicated from the point of view of science, but also from the point of view of governance. So rather than strata, the issue is that we are surpassing the climate or the planet limits in a way that puts our own lives at risk. So in the times of action, do we need science? And I would argue that yes, because I wouldn't like this action to take the form of what people did many years ago in New Zealand when the European, let's say, immigrants came with rats. So the solution were cats, and then the cats ate all the fauna that was in New Zealand. I mean, that's a pretty bad solution for a problem. And we wouldn't like to act on the basis of wrong assumptions and wrong knowledge and wrong information. We want to have the good information and we want to have the good science as a basis, as one of the bases for taking decisions. So we want to be cautious and act safely, but act fast, which is pretty much a change for everything. We cannot take several decades to take action. We must take action now. So I would say yes, we must act, but keep thinking and keep thinking because there are surprises. We do not know all the surprises that will come along in the next decades. And that's a fact in our reality. We know a lot, we know we can predict things, but there are uncertainties and there are surprises ahead. And we must face those surprises. So science is still needed. And it's not only because I want to have a work, because I do have already plenty of work that I could do. I keep my science going, wondering why something happens. So as an example, what have you done as a center of excellence in a country that is in between development or not, that is in between high emission rates or not? We are about 5 kilotons per capita, which is more or less the average of the world. So yes, we have provided a couple of big products. One is a report that you will find a few copies there about the drought that our country has been facing over the last 7 years already in the most populated part of the country. And that report is put in words that are understandable, not in the jargon of scientists, telling the story about climate variability and climate change, telling that 25% of the drought that we have been seeing over the last years is a result of climate change as produced by human activities, but also the consequences in terms of fires, which will connect with my colleague will tell you about, with the impacts in the coastal oceans, with the impacts in vulnerability for people producing potatoes in southern Chile, for small producers of potato, etc. And also the framework for governance in terms of the climate law that's been proposed in collaboration with people from the parliament, and I see one of our senators there, with people from government and with different stakeholders. And also particularly key issues like solar power, understanding radiation in northern Chile, which is an extremely potent area for producing energy and clean energy for Chile and also for the region. That's something that we have also studied over the years. Now, what are the questions we are addressing right now? We are writing a few papers, a group of papers addressing the Anthropocene in Chile, and particularly what we have learned from the past, from the records. What are the challenges of urbanization? Chile is a highly urbanized country. Roughly 90% of our people live already in big cities. And these cities pose challenges to governance, to climate. They are connected to the emissions of carbon dioxide, but also to short-lived climate pollutants, an issue which is of concern also for several countries in the area. Land use change, of course. We have may disappear a significant part of the forestry of natural or native forests. Long-term variability in precipitation also changed with a strong signal of natural variability, but also a signal of climate perturbation by human activities. How does impact the social vulnerability, the resilience, our capabilities for facing the future? So at the crossroads of taking development as how do we develop, the science of those questions are part of the questions we have to address in order to have the right answer, the right information to address the challenges of the future. It's a part of it. There are other issues to be acted upon, but those are examples. So, and governance in the Anthropocene is perhaps the most challenging of all of the questions we have to face in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I think you set the scene perfectly, really, in that the urgency of the challenge, as you know, we're passing so many planetary boundaries. And so really, as of course the Paris Agreement acknowledged, we really have to be very ambitious now to stay, if we have a chance of staying well below 2 degrees. And so that takes us perfectly into the next presentation by Angelo. Angelo is also, you're also at the Climate Resilience Center. Okay, now I found your bio, actually. Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. No, you're the Chief Negotiator of Environmental Services at the National Forest Corporation of the Agricultural Ministry of Chile. So Angelo Sartori. Well, thank you. I mean, it's great to have someone particularly from the Agriculture Ministry, because I think, as we know, and we're hearing more and more actually in this context, that agriculture is both potentially, particularly in our region in Latin America, one of the biggest contributors to climate change, but of course is highly, highly vulnerable to climate impacts. So Angelo, you're now going to talk about Chile's national strategy on climate change and natural resources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this event, because only last week in our country we presented in a public event the National Strategy of Climate Change and Vegetation Resources. That is this document. I have a gift for you, only for 2 people here in the audience. I have only those 2 books. And yesterday, our president here in the COP22 was talking about the importance of this initiative to achieve the commitment that we have included in our INDC. So the reason of this event is to show some specific example in our country how it's possible to cross out from the Paris Agreement to implement the initiative and achieve the goals that we have already in our country. And another very important issue that we are included here in this presentation is, in our opinion, the importance to include in all the sectorial plans or strategy in the same level the goals that we already have in the national INDCs. The reason is very easy to understand. When you have the approval of the INDC in the Congress, in the National Congress, obviously you have a political support to carry out several specific issues that you need to implement. The first one is the budget. The second one is the appropriation of the national institution to carry out the implementation of this kind of activity. So we are waiting right now in our Congress, maybe in next weeks, the approval of the INDC, and will be very important to us for all the sectorial plans that we have already included our strategy. Okay. Related to the forest sector that we include in the INDC, we have 2 mainly objectives to achieve. One of them is forested at least 100 hectares, mainly with native species. Yeah? And the second one is to develop sustainable management in the native forests of our country in the same surface. Yeah? We have this double goal included in our INDC. If you read the document of the INDC, you can see the link to download in Spanish and also in English, the document. We put explicit the strategy as an instrument to implement these two objectives there. So I provide some information related how is possible, how the manner that we think implementing the next year, at least all the goal that we have represented here in the INDC. Okay, here we have some specific principles that we include in the national strategy, trying to put in the same level the strategy and the goals of the INDC. And the first one is that we are follow all the decisions that all the countries taken here in UNFCCC convention related to the red scheme. Yeah. For example, we did already the identification of the driver of deforestation and degradation, the forest degradation. We are follow all the guidelines that are approved here in this COP, in the last COP, obviously, related to the carbon accountability, and also trying to meet all the called environmental and social safeguard. Yeah. So we are follow a package of decisions that are already approved here in the convention. And the strategy include all these guidelines. On the second point, very important for us, is that we not included only forests. The reason is very important. Several parts of our country doesn't have forests, but we have another kind of vegetation, for example, wetlands, xerophytic formation, and very important to work and develop some specific project in these areas to reduce the vulnerability of the ecosystem, but also the vulnerability of the people that depend of these areas. Yeah, so we include forests, wetland, and another kind of resources in the north of the country where it's very dry. Yeah. In the same way, we put in the same level all the targets and commitment that we have in the 3 Rio Convention. We work not only with the guidelines related to the UNFCCC. In our case, our institution is also the focal point of the convention related to combat the desertification, and obviously we are related to the biodiversity convention of the United Nations. So we put all the indicators in the same level in this context. Another very important issues to implement in the next year and to achieve the commitment related to the ANDC is to have the specific measure that we have to develop. And here in the strategy, in the document, we include 2 kinds of measures. One of these are related, for example, to the institutional arrangement or the definition of new policy or program that we have to carry out in our country. This had to be very close related to another kind of measure that we already identified, that we call a direct measure. That means that you have to develop specific activities in the field. From our perspective, for example, deforestation activities, working very close with the communities, also restoration of degraded land, and to avoid, for example, some problems that we have with several emissions in our country related to the forest fire. Yeah, this is not the principal driver that we have to combat in our country to reduce the emission and reduce also the vulnerability. And another very important point that we have to put on the table when you want to implement is to identify the budget. So in this document, we have information about the budget that we already have, but also the budget that we need and we don't have. But we are looking for the sources where it's possible to get more money in the next year to implement. For example, the Green Climate Fund and another ones related to RED Plus and also related to combat the desertification activities. So all these points in our mind are the principal ones to have very clear how it's possible to implement in the future. Yeah, you have several scale, some related to law and another one to some institutional arrangement and to establish some agreement, for example, with the municipalities. But obviously you have to put in the same level the budget that you need. So finally, we only have to say that we have to put in the same level the specific goals that we have with the numbers. For example, here you have the table that show the two goals, forest goal included in the INDC related to the forest. And also, there are the goals related to the national strategy, where the level of ambition is a little increase, because we know in the next year we have also to increase the level of ambition of this goal in some update that we have to do. Yeah, but it's very necessary to establish this link between the goals that we establish in a sectoral plan and also in line with the INDC that cover all the sector in our country. Yeah, from our sector, and trying to put the title of this side event, we think the next step that we have to do is cross from the Paris Agreement to the field with the farmers, with the landowners. And that is all the issues that we include in this document that you can read in detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angelo. And I think we'll see in particular how you're bringing all the indicators from the three conventions into your strategy. I think that was sounds like really also it was a very nice kind of segue to our next presenter, the fact that you've identified your budget, what you have, and also what you need. And I know that's been quite a big focus of what Colombia has been doing over this last year. So I'm delighted to introduce Sylvia Calderon from the Department of National Planning within the government of Colombia.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Mandy, and the whole IDB team for inviting us to share with you today the roadmap that Colombia has been designing and in a way also implementing in order to be on the track of the implementation of our NDC. This is definitely some challenge for Colombia as well as for other countries, but we believe that we are on a track that is going to be successful and that is worth sharing with you. So just to remind you and to start off our NDC, we committed to reducing our GHG emissions by 20% by 2030 in relation to a baseline. This is the unilateral part of our NDC. However, if we get international cooperation, this ambition can increase to 30%. Our NDC, of course, also had a part on adaptation, which is very important for the country, given Colombia's geographical position and also patterns of development. We're extremely vulnerable to climate change. So for us, it is very important, not only internationally, but also locally, to make progress on adapting to climate change. So our NDC on adaptation basically stated that Colombia would be covered entirely in 100% of its national territory with climate adaptation plans. And even though this is a goal more related to designing policy, we are on the right track of implementing such plans. Now, in order to start with the implementation process, we needed to make sure that all the different stakeholders in the country were aligned and we're having exactly the same objective. So we put in place a national climate change system which works both at the national and at the subnational level. So at the national level, we basically operate under a high-level commission on climate change, which meets all the ministries, relevant ministries, such as the Ministry of Finance, the Minister of Planning, where I come from, the sectoral ministries, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On the other hand, we also we also created a couple of committees in order to make sure from the technical part and also from the financial part that those high-level discussions are implemented at the ground level. From the subnational level, we created climate change regional nodes in which many different stakeholders at the regional level participate, including subnational territories and municipalities as well. So within this system, then, one of the first tasks or the first step was to, we started working first on our mitigation committee, right? The first question that many of the ministers put to the table was, how am I going to be accountable for the emissions? For example, as you see here in this figure, you find the distribution of emissions by different models from 2010 and 2030. This is the baseline. So when we pointed, for example, the emissions from land use change, the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Agriculture didn't feel directly related to those emissions. So it was important, and this is the first step, to distribute those emissions between the different ministers so they could be held accountable for the reductions that we were going to distribute among each of the ministers. So this is an important task that it took us a couple of months, and it was basically a combination of a technical task as well as a political task. So something to take into account from this figure is that currently land use change emissions are the highest for the country, basically deforestation, and secondly, agriculture. But in 2030, this is going to change. Energy will start taking a little bit more importance as the country starts becoming even more urban and more industrialized as well. Now, once we kind of attributed each of the emissions to each ministry, we came up with an idea. This idea was based on a simple rule, which is everyone is committed to reducing 20%. If everyone reduces 20% their emissions by 2030, then we will be able to accomplish a 2030 overall country goal. So we started negotiating with each of the ministries how were they going to achieve this, and whether the mitigation measures that were part of the NDC, they felt comfortable with them, with the information, with the costs, with the scope of each of the measures. So far, we've been working for probably 8 months, and we have still some ambition to achieve. Right now, as you see in the column that is highlighted, you see basically that so far we have reached 16 of our 20% goal. So we still have a lot of work to do. And some of the ministries, such as, for example, the first one that you see right there, that's the Ministry of Agriculture. They're very ambitious. They basically are committing to almost twice, 2.5 times what they are supposed to be held accountable due to the goal. But there are other ministries, such as, for example, the Ministry of Transportation, which is the fifth, that is not so ambitious. So we are in this negotiation, the negotiations are taking place right now, and some of the ministries are becoming even more ambitious when they see these figures that they're not performing so well. Then it was important, in order to be on the track of implementation, to answer 3 questions. The first one is, are the ministries by themselves responsible for taking action, or do they have to coordinate with other ministries and even with subnational governments? So first, we try to answer the question, and then you find that almost 30% of actions are of the only responsibility of the ministry. So the minister can start working on those 30% of measures that were identified. The second question that we wanted to answer was, what are the sources of funding? Are they public? Are they private? And we find that basically between 65 and 75% of the measures need private funding, and the 25%, the rest of the 25% of resources come from the public sector. But now in here, we understand that those 25% of investments from the public sector are key in order to unlock the other 75%. And then the last question was, how many of the measures require government intervention in the sense of economic instruments, either taxes or subsidies, or norms, regulation, legislation in general? Oh, and of course, 90% of the measures require some action in that sense. As we were doing this, we were making progress in linking goals with our climate and development strategies. We're putting together a national climate change policy, which basically feeds from the national adaptation, mitigation, and REDD+ strategies that have programs at the sectoral and territorial levels. And we're in the process of building a pipeline and also of identifying those sources of financing, like available funds that we are having right now in order to be able to finance those efforts. Just to finish, we're also putting together a climate finance strategy. This is the vision of the strategy, which is based like a general vision. By 2030, we will have sustainable and scalable financial resources to achieve green, resilient, low carbon development. And we understand that having regulation and economic instruments, market instruments, and financial instruments all together related to an overall policy, it's key in order to mobilize resources. And this is my last slide. Again, it is very important to understand and to be able to know the needs in terms of mitigation. We're making progress on mitigation. This is some numbers, but we have to make more progress on adaptation. Understanding the adaptation needs is a little bit harder than the mitigation needs, but we need to do so as well. So our estimations show that implementing the mitigation NDC for the country would cost around 3 billion. Oh, sorry, there's a mistake. $1 billion annually. This is almost 0.4% of our GDP. And again, most of these investments are private, right? And some of them are public, like 70% are private, 25% are public. Now, we also analyze our budget. What's the amount of the current budget, the national budget so far, that could be mainstream with climate change? And this is something that we keep on hearing all around the COP, which is the resources are there. We just have to make sure that when we do transportation, that when we do energy, that when we bring water and sanitation, that when we are trying to reduce our development gaps, they are sustainable, they are low carbon, and they are resilient. So in Colombia, almost 85% of national public budget could be mainstream with climate change. And that's where we're focusing right now, trying to reduce that gap between the development finance agenda and the climate change finance agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I think it's excellent to see the continuing evolution of Colombia's institutional framework around the national climate change agenda, particularly now, obviously, for the NDC. And I know I've been involved and had discussions with the government over probably actually since 2008 on your climate agenda. And so I really, feel very, it's very impressive to see this continuous evolution and institutional growth, if you like, around the climate agenda. So we're going to turn now, having heard from two countries from the region, we're going to move now to think more about from the financing perspective and what kind of support can help to ensure implementation of the NDCs, and not just in the short term, but also thinking over the medium and longer term in terms of scaling up of investment. And I'm going to say a few words about what we're doing at the IDB, but actually, rather than talk too much, I thought it would be good to show you a video we prepared, which this is the English version, I think. Oh, it's the Spanish version. Okay, well, good. Hopefully most of you will understand it. It's quite visual anyway. And so this gives you some idea of what we're trying to do, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards.
En la región de América Latina y el Caribe, el Grupo Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo ha creado NDC Invest, un producto único que reúne todas nuestras actividades en una sola plataforma y que tiene como objetivo apoyar a los países de la región para que puedan transformar sus compromisos nacionales en planes de inversión factibles. NDC Invest consta de 4 elementos claves. NDC Programa. En base a nuestra experiencia, identificaremos las necesidades y las circunstancias climáticas actuales y venideras para crear las condiciones que permitirán la implementación de los planes de inversión, involucrando a actores del sector público y privado. NDC acelera. Apoyaremos los estudios de prefactibilidad y actividades necesarias para desarrollar carteras de inversión y asegurar la viabilidad técnica y financiera de cada proyecto. NDC impulsa. Proveeremos recursos reembolsables y no reembolsables para generar nuevos modelos de negocio innovadores, pilotar instrumentos financieros adicionales y servicios de mercado. Financia. Movilizaremos financiación de fuentes internas y externas para mitigar los riesgos de las inversiones climáticas acordes a las prioridades de los países y sus NDCs. En el grupo Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, estamos aunando esfuerzos por integrar consideraciones climáticas y de sostenibilidad en las estrategias de desarrollo de los países. Tomando acción ahora, podemos asegurarnos que en el 2050 tendremos una región que produce alimentos de manera segura y sostenible, valora su biodiversidad y capital natural, alberga ciudades sostenibles diseñadas para sus ciudadanos, con economías, infraestructuras y comunidades resilientes a los impactos del clima y los desastres naturales. Únete en ndcinvest.org.
Thank you. So for those of you that understood, probably have, for those of you that...
As the leading climate partner of choice for Latin America
Now you're
and
going to
the
get the
Caribbean,
English version.
we at the IDB Group have created NDC Invest, a one transform their
I prefer
national
the woman's
climate
voice in
commitments
the,
into
Spanish
achievable
version,
short
I have
and
to say.
medium-term investment
So,
plans.
well, maybe...
NDC programmer, bringing...
Okay, we'll run the English version at the end. Well, as we move, but just to briefly summarize what NDC Invest is all about, we really wanted to ensure that both to our countries, but also the private sector we work with, but also as well as internally inside the IDB group, that we are really seeing the NDCs as the basis for opportunity for investments and for growth, and linking very much to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, how to bring forward the investments in sustainable infrastructure and sustainable landscapes, most notably, given those are probably the two biggest challenges from the point of view of delivering the low carbon and climate resilient pathway. Hence the focus on invest as being about investment opportunities, because that's what we genuinely believe it is all about. And the four main components that you heard about, the first is the programmer, and that is really looking at programming the NDCs into budget planning, sectoral planning and policy making processes, identifying where there may be gaps to plug in terms of policy and institutional MRV, for example. But also we have an internal dimension that this is also about us, how we look at the NDCs or each country's NDC in the context of our programming as the IDB. So we are currently looking at next year's pipeline, for example, and pipeline for the next year and the year after, and looking at how the country's NDC will be relevant to the types of projects that will be agreed with. And this is always a dialogue with the Ministry of Finance or Planning. And so that is the internal dimension. The accelerator, I'm not going to say much because I'm very happy that Pasi Helm from the Nordic Development Fund is here, because we are collaborating with NDF on the pipeline accelerator, which, as it sounds, the idea is to work on or provide additional resources to do the necessary activities to help accelerate good transformational projects through our pipeline, in particular sustainable infrastructure, but again, we see sustainable landscapes as also being where we need to have that additional resource to bring the good projects forward, the good pipeline of projects. The third component is the booster, market booster. This is primarily going to be working with SMEs. We already have a number of trust funds inside the bank, the biggest of which is the Multilateral Investment Fund, FORMIN, and we are looking to align these resources in support of countries' NDCs, recognizing we have to focus on strengthening domestic markets to ensure that NDC and NDC investments are about jobs, local business, new opportunities. And through this market booster, we aim to prototype, pilot, support new business models, financial instruments that will be necessary, and other market services. And then the finance mobilizer, as it sounds, looking to mobilize finance in support of NDCs. That could be our own finance or what we increasingly see the importance of through using concessional resource by either blending or using it through risk mitigation instruments, looking to really mobilize much greater additional resources, particularly from the private sector. But also we will look to mobilize trust funds that we have internally. We have a JICA $2 billion renewable energy trust fund. We have a China fund. All these resources that could be mobilized in support of the NDC Invest, we see as being necessary. And this is part of, again, how we are aligning ourselves as a financial, as a development bank in support of countries, NDCs, and of course the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So I think that actually turns or leads very nicely the focus on concessional resource very nicely to our next panelist, Mafalda Duarte, who I'm sure many of you know is head of the Climate Investment Fund's admin unit. And as many of you, I'm sure I'm aware, the climate investment funds have been a very significant source of concessional resource in enabling a lot of transformational investments. Certainly in our region, we have very much been able to work and deliver on a range of investments and programs in Colombia, in Chile, in Mexico, in many countries, at Bolivia. And so I'm delighted to be able to introduce Mafalda to say some more about the challenges moving forward.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to stand. I don't have any presentation. Thank you, the Inter-American Development Bank, Government of Chile, for inviting us to be here today. Very interesting presentations by all of the previous speakers. I give a bit of my own and our own perspective on NDCs based on 8 years of experience of testing a programmatic business model. But just starting by saying that it's actually very good to see. Let me start actually by saying something else. This instrument, it's a very interesting instrument, the NDCs. It's sort of, in my view, focused the attention on tangible targets in mitigation. To some extent, it also focuses the attention on adaptation. Though less tangible yet at this stage, but it's 189 countries have submitted this NDCs. These are at various degrees of detail, of coverage, of even in terms of costing. Only 52 of them are costed. And so really what this shows is that of course, this links to the political will of coming out of the process leading to the Paris Accord, and to the and sort of it's highlights that political commitment and will, but at the same time also highlights that there's quite a bit of work to be done to actually make these instruments drivers of change in the countries, by also bringing not just national actors together, but the national and international actors together in the pursuit of the same goals. And as you might expect, I think, the case of Colombia that was presented here was an interesting case because it looks like it's it comes from, or it's the outcome of things that have been happening over the years and work that has been occurring in the country in terms of developing national strategies for climate and sectoral strategies, and putting in place certain pieces of regulatory frameworks and legal frameworks. But also one can expect that as we might see the NDCs as an evolution of all of that work in countries like Colombia, we have many other countries where this is not the case. And in fact, there are many countries in the world that for the first time are coming up with their national strategies for climate. They are coming up for the first time with reflecting on their institutional frameworks to coordinate climate change activities, which is actually, we should not underestimate the challenge of that. So the point is that, when even we think about NDCs, we have to be very careful that the circumstances across countries will be very different, and the support that will be necessary will have to be tailored and different as well. Though the goal, it's still the same. I think another important point to bear in mind, and I know that this is something that it's close to the heart of IDB and many others, is the sustainable infrastructure piece. We have a Paris Accord, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a big challenge because the expectations in terms of levels of investment in infrastructure over the next 15 years are very high. It's $90 trillion. 2/3 of this investment in developing countries. This is more than the global stock of infrastructure assets to date. And we need to make sure that these investments are resilient and low carbon. And so there has to be, the bridges and the linkages need to be clearly drawn. I'm going to reflect a little bit more about the experience that we've been having in the climate investment funds. As Emily was saying, these funds were established in 2008, which was the year of the financial crisis, as most of you will recall. Was a time where, the international negotiations had their challenges as well. There were some positive outcomes, but there were also big challenges. And so a group of countries came together from developed countries and developing countries with the 5 multilateral development banks that implement these resources in partnership with countries and private sector entities to put together these funds and start driving these type of investments in developing countries and demonstrating that actually these investments can be bankable investments, and we need to start learning and establishing a record of performance in these markets for these first of its kind investments. The way we have done this is through a programmatic approach, which means that the countries themselves, in partnerships with multilateral development banks, but much more broadly with civil society and private sector, indigenous groups, coming together and looking at the challenges that the countries are facing and the opportunities that are presented to them in a particular sector or a range of sectors, and then deciding the range of activities that should be supported, from upstream work, which means legal, regulatory work, all the way down to investments. So I think, one of I'm going to refer 4 points in terms of key lessons that we've learned. We've implemented this model in 50 countries. We are right now preparing these programs, what we call investment plans, in another 20 countries. And so we have been learning for the past 8 years. One important thing that probably underpins the presentations that we've heard from Chile and Colombia, though might not have been extraordinarily explicit, but I'm very confident that's the case, you probably have very sound processes of consultation, multi-stakeholder consultation in the country when you prepare, strategies and potentially when you prepare the NDCs. This is something that we've learned is critical. It is very important, the engagement of the range of stakeholders that will actually be important to make these goals a reality. As you have rightly said, Sylvia, that it was important for you to translate the sectoral GHG allocations to a sort of an institutional allocation so that there could be accountability across the government. You know, it is aligned. We also have to think that have that same principle applied to the overall society. We sort of need to have those processes of multi-stakeholder engagement and consultation to get the buy-in and the engagement of all of the key stakeholders. And importantly, public and private. Private capital will be key, and we really need to understand how do we unlock the private capital, not just international one, but the domestic one. And so engaging them in these conversations and processes, I believe and we believe is very important. Very important. Both countries have done so. Many other countries, it is a challenge to ensure strong interministerial coordination and the different ministries coming together to talk about, the synergies across sectors. How do they come together in driving these agendas? And then, we also heard about another point that was not necessarily reflected in these presentations, but as much as I know of both countries, I know that it is something that both countries work on very closely, is to make sure that as you think of NDCs, you also think about systems for national level monitoring and tracking progress. And we also know there that, some ministries have more sophisticated systems, other ministries have less sophisticated systems. Some countries have national statistical systems or surveying systems that are stronger, others weaker. It is an area that is very important, and finding mechanisms so that there are feedback loops coming back to the planning processes and decision-making processes. And of course, making these living documents because as you rightly said, Laura, surprises ahead. and we don't know precisely what the future will look like, and we will have to keep making adjustments more regularly than we might anticipate. So I think, two of my key messages is countries are at very different stages. They have had very different experiences. When we now are thinking of helping them in this journey, we have to be mindful of that. We have to help them learn from what they have already. That might not be obvious, that there are lessons out there that can be used, but there are. And the work that they've been doing with us is one of them, but work that is done at the national level in terms of coming up with other strategies. So that's a key message. And another one is, we have to be this idea of being dynamic and the surprises. We have to. The challenge is extremely big. And I don't think most of us, certainly when I'm thinking about these issues and the transformations that have to occur in these economies and in these countries and in the society and behaviors for us to get to where we have to go, it's very large. And so we have to be prepared to learn as much as we can from the past, but also think about that we have to look at things differently. Otherwise, we are not going to make it. A lot of things will have to happen simultaneously, and we will need the broad-based support and engagement if we're going to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mafalda. And I just want to emphasize, actually, a lot of the thinking as we were developing NDC Invest, a lot of it was learning from the climate investment funds. So the programmatic approach, investment plans, ensuring we have resource to do good transformational project preparation. And so it's very much actually the product of everything we at the IDB Group have learned through being one of the implementing entities for the climate investment funds. So thank you. And of course, that turns perfectly now to Pasi Hellman, who is the Managing Director of the Nordic Development Fund and a very good partner of the IDB Group. And in particular now, as Mafalda also referred to, we have a very strong interest in how we can mobilize investments in sustainable infrastructure and sustainable landscapes, and recognizing that one of the key challenges is to bring good projects, the good pipeline of projects forward. So we're delighted to be collaborating with NDF, and I'm delighted that you're here with us today, Pasi.
Thank you very much, Amalie, and let me also thank the Inter-American Development Bank and the government of Chile for arranging and hosting this event, and I'm honored and privileged to have been invited to say a few brief remarks in this event. And at the outset, I need to say that I'm absolutely impressed by the level and depth of thinking and analytical work done in the two countries and the presentations we heard. And I think they are very good examples where things related to NDCs have been taken seriously and in a professional manner forward. And like Mafalda said, it's not necessarily the case in all countries in the world. I thought I would focus my comments on three issues or three set of issues, naturally the NDC Invest being one of them. But before that, maybe very briefly, a little bit about where I and the organization I'm heading, Nordic Development Fund, come from into the picture of broader climate finance architecture. We are established and owned by the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, Norway. And in a nutshell, our mission is to provide financing and knowledge for climate change and development activities, primarily in low-income countries, but also to some extent in lower middle-income countries. Within that mission and mandate, our more sort of a focused strategic niche in the world of very many big and smaller and medium-sized climate finance institutions and funds is to particularly target projects which have a significant scale-up potential, so that we could catalyze and leverage other follow-on investments. We are very much targeting on opportunities early on in the project cycle, project preparatory type of funding, again to facilitate and catalyze further funding to follow-on activities. We are very strongly focusing on innovation, targeting new climate solutions, not only technologies for mitigation, but also I would say social type of innovations, which are particularly relevant in the climate adaptation activities. And with our background coming from the Nordic countries and the Nordic region, and having our own experiences from our countries in that particular front in social development, I think that gives us some strengths in that type of work. We are also very much focused on piloting of high-risk interventions with targeted grant or blended finance. and also emerging climate change issues, which would allow for dynamic and evolving solutions and also climate threats maybe. All that in a way that tries to engage both the public and the private sector, often in a way that our public sector interventions can directly be of benefit to private sector actors and private sector development. So when you hear that our sort of a strategic emphasis is very much favoring on catalytic role and innovative approaches to emerging climate issues, I think you can understand that since Paris and having the aspirational NDCs on paper, it is very much in our interest to promote that, developing them into concrete deliverables, and I think it is perhaps one of the most urgent issues for all of us in realizing the Paris targets. Now, secondly, I want to focus on our collaboration with IDB and particularly on the NDC Invest and the accelerator part. Our two institutions, or the collaboration between them, goes back in time a couple of decades, and it's been very fruitful collaboration, at least from our point of view. And I would even say that us being a fairly small institution with no permanent country offices or presence, we are really depending on larger partners like IDB. And it's interesting that in the Latin America region, IDB is actually an exclusive trusted partner to NDF, which I think shows how strong the relationship is. We have a variety of projects in our joint co-financing portfolio. Many of them relate to somehow possibilities to support small and medium-sized enterprises in addressing causes and consequences of climate change. And again, there are also activities that relate to adaptation issues and even adaptation as a business prospect for private sector actors. We have green finance instruments targeting SMEs. We have climate resilience type of activities, and I think the most recent addition in the portfolio is something called energy savings insurance, which would promote access to finance and insurance coverage for SMEs investing in energy efficiency upgrades and technologies. So against this background, the idea about NDC Invest platform and need to specifically target to accelerate production and development of projects, climate projects, to enable their implementation to be speeded up has been a very interesting opportunity for us. We have identified as common bottleneck often in climate projects, also elsewhere, that one needs to ensure technical and financial feasibility and sustainability of the project through upstream work and addressing critical constraints and barriers to delivery of projects that are aligned with NDCs. In fact, the NDC accelerator, which was nicely already featured in the video, but I'll say a couple of more words about it. Accelerator will support country authorities as well as private sector to solve upstream design and planning challenges, thereby developing sustainable and bankable projects. It will deploy grants and reimbursable grants to cover costs that are associated with planning, identifying and preparing sustainable infrastructure, agriculture, land use projects, and really accelerating these through stages of financing. We think it fills an urgently needed niche in the project cycle, again, upstream, and we're happy that we are one of the first collaborators of IDB under the NDC Invest platform. Quite simply, I think the NDF support to the accelerator makes possible development of bankable projects delivering on NDC commitments. And it's interesting in a way because we also operate and collaborate in other regions of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. And interestingly, we have established a fairly similar facility already earlier this year with the Asian Development Bank, focusing on Southeast Asian countries to assist these countries also to take forward their NDC plans and priorities. And we were a little bit ahead of IDB in those discussions, but interestingly, when we discussed those, and those discussions started like a little bit over a year ago and were concluded in the spring this year. I checked this before this event, and we didn't really mention the word acceleration or accelerate in those discussions or documents, but it's basically focusing on same things. So it's also interesting how the vocabulary and fashions in the climate finance evolve and how quickly they can evolve. But all in all, this accelerator links up very nicely with the existing NDF IDB collaboration and co-financing portfolio I was referring to. And our hope is that since IDB has given such high-level, high-profile strategic emphasis and interest to the NDC Invest platform, is to bring our other activities to be part of the, or somehow under the broader umbrella of NDC investments. And again, we're very happy to collaborate with IDB on that. Lastly, I just wish to conclude very briefly by saying a brief general remark on NDCs. And I do it by referring to another person, previous development minister or minister for international development of Norway, Heikki Holmås, who was speaking in another event at the Nordic Pavilion actually yesterday, and he was referring to the experience and lessons from the Nordic countries when he became the minister, and he saw the world of development finance and climate finance and how people were talking about plans and grand plans, and he was thinking that when the Nordic countries, when his country, and I can say the same thing about all the Nordic countries, when they developed decades ago or started to develop, there were no grand plans. There were values perhaps, and yes, there were, but things were really put into action. And I think it's very important to focus on putting things into action. We know that the plans vary in quality. There's always room to refine, develop, strengthen, improve plans, and that should be done, like NDCs. And I'm very happy to hear that how that is being done. But at least equally important is to move ahead as quickly as possible with concrete action, with the material and with the existing plans and information one has. And therefore, I'm very happy to see that NDC Invest is actually emphasizing this and making this happen. And that's why we as NDF are very happy to be partners to NDC Invest. Thanks.
Thank you. And we, of course, are very, very happy to have NDF as the first major partner in NDC Invest. I'm going to now ask if there are any questions. We don't have a huge amount of time, and we have a very nice reception outside. I hear there is champagne, so we want to get out before other people get to it. And of course, we can continue the discussions outside the room. But does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask to the panel? I think there's someone at the back there, someone here. Okay, we do have a microphone, but maybe, okay, all right, there's two and one at the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Alberto Galante from Perspectives. I would like to ask, because now it's clear that for countries to move from these high-level intended commitments to NDC implementation. And this has been said, every single funding source, financing source is needed. And this has been mentioned several times today, public-private budget, both at the national and international level. In this sense, I would like to ask both to the countries and also to the IDB, what is the role that the market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement can play? Thank you very much.
I think maybe because we don't have a huge amount of time, we'll take the 3 questions here and then have response. And then I think there were 2 there. Yeah, that's 3, including you, Chris.
Thank you for the highly enjoyable panel. My name is Matthew Redding from Civicus. And my question was regarding the point on unlocking private capital and the role of international tax reform as a means to raise the 3 to 5 billion trillions of dollars that are being estimated annually to ensure these NDCs are implemented fully.
Okay, we'll take all the questions and don't worry. Please, yeah.
Okay, do you mind if I speak in Spanish?
No, that's fine, yes. Well, I'm not sure if we... Okay.
Bueno, soy Matías Opaso. Mi pregunta está enfocada más bien en el rol de la ciencia. Tengo muy claro que la ciencia es muy necesaria en estos temas, pero la crítica más grande que ha tenido el movimiento del cambio climático en cuanto a la ciencia es la capacidad de comunicarse. De hecho, ya en el siglo XIX habían indicios de que estaba ocurriendo el cambio climático y recién en el siglo XXI se está haciendo algo al respecto. Entonces, quería saber un poco cómo se van a asegurar de que las distintas partes entiendan la importancia de hacerse cargo del cambio climático, ya sea a nivel político, ya sea a nivel empresarial o a nivel ciudadano.
Thank you. And it was 1 here and 1 there. Okay, so you have the mic. Chris,
okay.
Go ahead.
So I've got 1 request, 1 question. The request is to Mafalda, because fantastic presentation and discussion about the country investment plans. I think there's lots of people now out there trying to develop those for the NDC. I think if CIF could share the insights from those 50 that you've talked about and the others, I think it would be really, really excellent. I think there's so much demand for that at the moment. Secondly, it's really for Pasi and for Amelie about the scale of the support that you're planning on providing. Sorry, my name's Chris Dodd. I work for Ricardo Energy Environment. We worked on about 15, 16 different INDCs. The amount of money that was being offered to support countries to develop those was incredibly small in some cases. And the amount of money that is going to be needed to actually bring the private sector to get their checkbooks out, to actually invest in this, the technical assistance that will need to be done is orders of magnitude different. And when I speak to donors, I talk about the discussions in the UK or the EU, how they put together, how they try to encourage getting investment into low carbon, into nuclear, getting private sector to invest in these things. You have to get some really, really strong private sector based advice to de-risk that. How are you going to counter that?
Yes, this is Luis Villarder from Equinixus. I would like to share a personal concern and to understand how IDB would be intending to lead with it. This new initiative is very, very exciting. And at the same time, my question is, that's perhaps something that Mrs. Duarte already raised, is how to improve statistics systems in countries that still have a path to go forward in order to make sure that they provide reliable data so that we can track progress, right, in NDCs implementations. I see that this is still a challenge, and I would like to know if IDBs also intends to support statistics systems beyond NDC Invest. Thanks.
So I think that's it on the questions for now. And maybe I'll start, Mafalda, if you'd like to respond to the questions put to you.
Okay. I'm going to be very brief. The role of market mechanisms, I think this is being discussed. It's precisely, you know, the discussions around Article 6. And so I myself am very interested as well, because to share a personal thought, I think we have a dichotomy here, which is, you know, we have been, my understanding has been that we have been focusing very much on being very precise about tons of carbon, and trying to be very precise about how many tons of carbon, and attributing a value to those units. And you know, the whole debate about methodologies, how do you account for that carbon, and there has been some progress, but you know, they're still limited, the amount of methodologies there are vis-a-vis the types of investments and sectors out there. So I think in all of those discussions on market mechanisms, there has to be a perspective that there has to be a balance between trying to be, you know, trying to count single units and driving big agendas. And so not to get too caught into, you know, trying to be very, very precise and specific about if it's 1 more ton here or 10,000 more tons here or not, because, you know, we need to see a shift in the direction. And for that, you know, leads me to the second point, which is the role of policies, including international tax reform. I think policies will be critical. Changes in economic policies will be critical. Without them, I don't think we're going to make it. They need to basically, these are the ones that will drive the signals for investment. Not only drive public investment, but will drive private investment. And so I think, you know, policy reform will be absolutely critical at country level and internationally. And I do hope to see, you know, continuing discussions. I don't know necessarily what you meant in terms of international tax reform. I could see that if you're thinking in terms of tax reform to generate another source of revenue that could then be used to de-risk private capital, absolutely, I would be in agreement to that, because what is needed is de-risking private capital going into developing countries. The science one I will leave to Laura. I take the point from you that it's important to share the lessons, and certainly we are placing quite a bit of emphasis there, not just in terms of the programs, but as I said, you know, we have such a body of knowledge related to so many investments that we've done, that in so many countries were first of its kind investments, that it's business models, it's financial structures, it's policy reform, that all of that needs to be harnessed and used going forward. And on the, and your point that, you know, in the knowledge and experience from private sector will be critical, I agree. And we are already seeing it as well in terms of, you know, we are trying to find ways of creating a new vehicle that will go into the capital markets, and to develop new vehicles to go into the capital markets. We already felt that there's a need for that type of expertise and bring it from the private sector, because it's where it lies. On the improvement of the statistical systems, I think I will allow the countries to speak. I do take note that that's also one area I think deserves attention.
You want me to take?
Okay. Times of the Anthropocene I referred to, I can tell you more about it in Spanish afterwards. With Champagne, it's much easier. The science is changing. It's changing because we were used to think slowly. We were focused on producing papers that we read eventually among each other, I mean, between us, but nobody else understands the jargon. And things are changing. I can tell you just experience of CR2. We are making an organizational study. And one of the things that is alluring for the scientists to be there, in addition to the difficulty of the problems to face, is the relevance. I don't know whether that's a matter of generations or not, being many of them younger than myself. But yes, we are worried about that. Now, science has been, I mean, from Bert Boulin, who happened to be my professor once upon a time, I mean, people have been, saying, hi, there's a problem coming, there's a problem coming. And that's been around quite a long time. So that awareness has been there. Definitely, yes, we need much more of a statistics to make the point, and in a broader sense, to have good at statistics. To have numbers is relatively easy. And sometimes the estimates of anything are made upon numbers by numbers, divided by numbers, and at the end is not good. So that again is statistics and science in a very broad sense. And I would emphasize, again, in the terms of markets and in terms of policies and everything, I think this is a call for everyone, scientists, everyone, is think out of the box. What we've been doing over the last 200 years, what we have been doing over the last 30 years, is not good enough. We have to think differently. Every one of us, as citizens, as people, as policymakers, as decision makers, as politicians, everyone has to think differently. That's quite a challenge, but that's also quite an opportunity. And I'm overwhelmed by the new things I'm learning from my colleagues. There is the head of human dimensions in our center. I've learned about law, I've learned about sociology. I'm a trained atmospheric scientist in atmospheric chemistry, physicist once upon a time. And I've learned quite a lot. And this is an amazing process. We are learning and we have the opportunity to change the world. That's it. And we can do it and we must do it.
Fully agree. Sylvia.
Well, I just want to basically try to answer all questions in just two remarks. The first one is that, as one of our colleagues was saying before, that it is all sources of finance are needed for this effort. I would say that this is the same for all different instruments, economic instruments, market instruments, financial instruments. So we need to make an effort in each country to try to design innovative instruments in all these different landscapes and make sure that they all align to the same objectives. In Colombia, for example, we need to make sure that climate change, let's say, instruments, economic instruments, are aligned with development instruments. And I'll give you just one example. In our rural areas, there is no cadastre. It's outdated, right? Without that cadastre, which is the main basic information needed to, for example, raise taxes at the landscape level, it is really hard to have sustainable rural development. This is one of the reasons why cattle ranching has taken so much of our land, not only at a very unproductive level, but also causing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of social and environmental and economic unrest in our rural areas. So if we don't have, for example, basic cadastre in which we can promote sustainable land use, it will be very hard, for example, to implement climate change strategies in our rural areas. So we need to make sure that there are policy aligned with economic instruments, but also economic instruments at different levels aligning to the same objective. And the second remark is regarding information. You were asking about statistics, and also Mafalda was referring to our MRV systems. In order to be able to track our progress, we need, of course, to build not only GSG MRV system, but also finance systems. This is what we're doing in Colombia with the support of many different institutions, including WRI, to build our climate finance MRV system, to be able to know whether we are making the right investments and also for the right reasons.
So we're being asked to vacate the room, but I don't want to not allow people the opportunity to speak. Please, Percy.
Thanks. Just a very brief comment on the question on scale of support. And of course, you need to separate maybe two things here. The broader, the larger NDC Invest platform, which is a sort of a broad initiative comprising 4 different pillars and activities. In a way, it's more for IDB and Amalie maybe to comment what is the scale of that, but that really, in my view, should be in scale, because that's a lot of activities that under the national under the NDCs. Our part, the pipeline accelerator, and I should have been maybe mentioning this earlier, that we still need to finalize some more details and get our board approvals, etc. And we aim to have that by or during the first quarter of next year. And we are thinking about NDF contributing somewhere in the level of 10 million euros or close to that, and maybe something from IDB.
Okay. Very briefly, because there are several questions, and we have the champagne waiting outside. It's not possible to respond everything, but I only want to say, related to the market approach that you ask. In our sector, in the forest sector, we are exploring the possibility to have maybe a local market. We have some pilot project there, because we think it's possible to get some money from the private sector in our country. We've established this kind of initiative. It's a possibility that we have, as in another country. For example, the forest sector can capture carbon, and obviously, and another ones produce several emissions, and we can establish a system to put this in a balance, obviously to get some investment from this kind of a scheme. So in this context, and aligning with that I say before, we are trying to prove in the field all the possibilities related to obtain the adequate budget to implement that the activities that we already have designed. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few questions directed to me. I think, I mean, in terms of carbon finance, carbon markets, of course, if that's what countries want to prioritize under their NDC, absolutely, we would work to support in those endeavors. In terms of unlocking private capital, yes, I mean, that's what we have to do, and whether it's through the whole range of fiscal measures at the particularly at domestic level. I'm not sure what you refer to in terms of tax reform at the international level, what specifically, but we need to ensure we have the full toolbox is brought to bear in terms of redirecting the trillions of investment away from high carbon and not resilient investments to those that are consistent with countries' pathways to low carbon and climate resilient development. And then in terms of data and systems, I think, well, we see that as being very important part of the support we provide. But I think also we see that there are a lot of, and you may be aware, the NDC partnership now has this data repository, trying to bring together data. The World Bank's contributed a lot of data around the NDCs. And I think actually it's going to be good to have a common set of data, not create too many different databases. So I think we would very much support engaging within that effort. And we are a member of the NDC partnership. And in terms of I think your question, Chris, yes, I mean, absolutely. We know we need a lot more grant resource available to ensure we can do the deep institutional capacity development and reform that is necessary. We've so far had, I would say, as MDBs, relatively limited amount of grant at our disposal. That tends to go through other agencies. But I think moving forward, we do need to ensure that we can better access different sources of grant, whether it's coming from the Green Climate Fund alongside the investments. I know in the CIFs, when they first started, there wasn't that much grant available, but actually that changed quite a lot. And particularly when you look under the PPCR, Pilot Program Climate Resilience, the Forest Investment Program, very significant amount of grant. I think we have for our program, Forest Investment Program in Guatemala, I was looking at around $30 million of grant effectively for that. So there is, you know, it is available, but it's not as plentiful and as available as it needs to be. And that's something that we need to ensure with the international community as resources are made available, that it's the right type of resource. It's not just about 100 billion, but it's about the quality of resource available. But I'd like to thank everyone for coming here, but more importantly, invite you to join us outside for champagne. Hopefully it's still there. Please, I'd be very happy to talk to any of you if I haven't responded, and I'm sure the panel would also be happy to do the same.